The call came at 2 in the morning, and I knew before I even answered it. I don't know how to explain that feeling, the way a mother's body knows something has gone wrong before her mind catches up. My hand was already shaking when I picked up the phone from the nightstand, and my heart was already doing that slow, terrible dropping thing it does when the world is about to change. It was a nurse at Mercy General. She said my daughter-in-law had called it in. She said my son Daniel had been found in the parking structure on the east side of the hospital, level 3, near the stairwell door, unresponsive. She used the word unresponsive 3 times, the way people do when they're trying to avoid saying something worse. I was 63 years old, a retired school teacher from Savannah, Georgia, with bad knees and a 10-year-old Toyota Camry that needed new brake pads. I had no business driving 40 minutes on the interstate at 2 in the morning. I drove it in 26. When I got to the emergency entrance, they made me wait. That's the cruelest thing hospitals do to mothers. They make you sit in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights and wait while your child is somewhere behind a set of doors you're not allowed to open. I sat there for 41 minutes. I counted the ceiling tiles. I prayed the way you only pray when you're genuinely terrified. Not the polite Sunday morning kind of prayer, but the raw bargaining kind, the kind where you're willing to offer up anything you have left. A young nurse came out eventually. She had dark circles under her eyes and a lanyard with a sunflower on it, and she looked at me for a moment before she spoke. Just a half second too long. And in that half second, I understood that what she was about to say was not the whole truth. She told me Daniel was stable. Blunt, forced trauma to the back of the head, possible concussion, they were running more tests. She said it appeared he had fallen in the stairwell. I nodded. I thanked her. And then, as she turned to go back through those doors, she stopped. She looked over her shoulder at me. She glanced toward the security desk. And then she looked back at me, and she lowered her voice to something just above a whisper. "Mrs. Calloway," she said. "He didn't fall." Then she pushed through the doors and was gone. I sat back down in that plastic chair, and I didn't move for a long time. Daniel was my only child. I had raised him alone after his father, my husband Raymond, passed from a heart attack when Daniel was 11 years old. I had worked 2 jobs some years, teaching 5th grade during the day, tutoring on evenings and weekends to make sure Daniel had what he needed. Not what he wanted, I couldn't always manage that, but what he needed. He was a good boy. He grew into a good man. Quiet, steady, the kind of person who remembered your birthday and showed up when you needed help moving furniture. He had a laugh that sounded exactly like his father's, and sometimes when he called me on Sunday afternoons, I had to close my eyes for a moment before I answered. He met Courtney Hartwell 3 years ago at a conference in Atlanta. She was a corporate attorney. She was beautiful and sharp-tongued, and she had a way of entering a room that made everyone in it feel slightly underdressed. I tried to like her. I want to be honest about that. I genuinely tried. But there was something underneath the politeness, something behind her eyes when she looked at me. A kind of careful measurement, like she was always calculating exactly how much of herself she needed to give and to whom. They married 8 months after they met. The wedding was at the Hartwell family estate outside of Bluffton, South Carolina. 400 guests, a string quartet, flowers that probably cost more than my car. Daniel stood at the altar, looking like the happiest man on earth, and I sat in the front row in the blue dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and I smiled until my face hurt. The Hartwells were old money. Harland Hartwell, Courtney's father, had made the original fortune in commercial real estate and then moved into private equity. He was the kind of man who had his name on buildings. Not loudly, not the way new money puts names on things, but quietly, on a small brass placard by the door, the kind you only notice if you're looking. He was cordial to me at the wedding. He shook my hand and said, Daniel was a fine young man. His eyes were the color of winter sky over the Georgia coast, pale and absolutely flat. His wife, Margaret, was warmer on the surface, but had the same calculation running underneath. She had Courtney's cheekbones and Courtney's habit of making you feel like a guest in your own conversation. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself I was just a mother having trouble letting go. I told myself these things for 2.5 years, while my son slowly became someone I recognized less and less each time I saw him. He stopped calling on Sundays. Then he stopped calling on birthdays. When I drove up to visit, they lived in a gated community in Hilton Head, a house that Harland had apparently gifted them, which I only learned from a Christmas card. Daniel seemed distracted, slightly absent, like a man listening for a sound in the next room while trying to hold a conversation. He lost weight. The laugh started disappearing, not all at once, but in pieces, the way a photograph fades if you leave it in the sun too long. I asked him once, directly, sitting in his kitchen while Courtney was out, if he was all right. He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face. I don't know what to call it exactly, some combination of exhaustion and want. And then it was gone and he smiled and said he was fine, just stressed at work. And did I want more coffee? I didn't push. I should have pushed. That is something I will carry for the rest of my life. The morning after I sat in that hospital waiting room, after they finally let me in to see my son, he was conscious by then, a white bandage around his head, an IV in his arm, eyes that looked at me with something that might have been relief, or might have been fear. I couldn't tell. Courtney arrived. She walked in with her coat still on and her heels clicking on the linoleum, and she kissed Daniel on the forehead, and then looked at me across the bed with an expression that was perfectly calibrated. Concerned wife, slightly surprised to find the mother-in-law already there, gracious about it. She said she was so glad he was going to be okay. She said it had been such a shock to get the call. She said she didn't know how it had happened. I watched her say all of these things. I watched her hands, which were steady. I watched her hands, which were steady. I watched her eyes, which were not. I went home that afternoon and I called my sister Evelyn. Evelyn is 2 years older than me and has lived in the same house in Beaufort, South Carolina for 30 years. She taught high school history for most of her life and has the kind of memory that comes from decades of needing to know exactly what happened and in what order and why. She is also the person who, when I told her about Courtney's family 3 years ago, had gone very quiet and then said, "Hartwell. Harland Hartwell. Evie, I need to think about that name for a minute." I hadn't understood what she meant then. I understood it now. "Tell me what you remember," I said when she picked up. There was a pause. I could hear her breathing. "You remember Daddy's friend Thomas Webb," she said. It wasn't a question. I did. Thomas Webb had worked for our father at his auto repair shop in the 80s. A quiet man, careful with his hands, good with engines. He had died in 1991. A car accident on the Savannah Highway, ruled accidental. Daddy never believed it was an accident, Evelyn said. "You were in college, you didn't hear all of it." But Thomas had been talking. He had been doing some contracting work out at the Hartwell properties, the old ones, the ones Harland's father built, and he'd seen something. Financial records, Evie. Off-book transactions. Property deals that involved people whose names you didn't want to know. He was going to go to the county. I sat down on my kitchen floor. I don't know why the floor. My legs just seemed to stop working. "Mama knew," I said. "Mama knew some of it," Evelyn said. "She didn't know all of it. But after Thomas died, she started paying attention. You know how Mama was. I knew how Mama was. Our mother had spent 30 years as a domestic worker, cleaning houses and offices all over the Savannah-Beaufort area. She was invisible in the way that working people are often invisible to wealthy people, which means she was present for conversations she was never meant to hear and had access to spaces she was never meant to fully inhabit. And she had, in the particular way of a woman who trusted no one with the important things but also refused to let the important things disappear, written things down. Not in any organized way. Not a journal, exactly. More like a habit. Receipts with notes on the back. pages torn from legal pads, date and name and what she saw or heard. She kept them in a shoebox in the back of her closet. When she passed, 7 years ago, Evelyn had been the one to clean out the house. "I kept them," Evelyn said. "I didn't know why, I just couldn't throw them away. I thought maybe someday someone would want to know." "Get them out," I said. "Evie, get them out, Evie." Daniel is in the hospital with a head wound that a nurse told me wasn't from a fall, and his wife's family has a history of making problems disappear, and I need to know what Mama knew. Another pause. "I'll call you back in 10 minutes, Evelyn said. What our mother had recorded, assembled across years of careful attention, was not a complete picture. It was a collection of fragments, names, dates, amounts, properties. But fragments, when you hold them up to the right light, can show you a great deal. Hartwell's father, a man named George Hartwell, had built the family's first real wealth in the 60s and 70s through a series of property acquisitions in coastal South Carolina that should not have been possible given the documented finances of his company at the time. Our mother had seen correspondence sitting on a desk in one of the houses she cleaned, a house belonging to a county official named Brennan, that connected George Hartwell to a series of transactions that appeared to involve land taken through what her notes described as pressure, threats, false liens. Several of the affected families were black. Several were elderly. Several had simply disappeared from their properties and resurfaced years later in different counties with no clear record of what had happened to their land. Thomas Webb had worked on the renovation of one of those properties. He had found, in a wall cavity, documents that had apparently been hidden and forgotten. He had made copies. He had told our mother about the copies 2 weeks before he died. Our mother had written, "Thomas says he gave the set to his brother in Atlanta for safekeeping. Told him if anything happened to hold them until someone came asking. I pray nothing happens. T is a good man." Thomas Webb's brother was named Curtis. He had lived in Atlanta. That was all she had written. I called Evelyn back. I said his name. I said we needed to find Curtis Webb or his family. "That's a long shot, Evie," she said. "It's been over 30 years. Then let's start looking." It took us 4 days. Evelyn, who had spent decades teaching teenagers to use library archives, turned out to be extraordinarily good at finding people through obituaries, church directories, and alumni records. Curtis Webb had died in 2008, but he had a daughter. Her name was Patricia Webb Morrison, and she lived in Decatur, Georgia, and when Evelyn finally reached her on the phone and explained who she was and why she was calling, there was a silence on the line that lasted so long that Evelyn thought the call had dropped. Then Patricia said, "My father told me someone might call someday. He made me promise to keep the envelope." I drove to Decatur on a Thursday morning with Evelyn in the passenger seat and 30 years of family history sitting somewhere in a house we hadn't reached yet. We didn't talk much on the drive. The azaleas were blooming along the highway and the sky was the particular pale gold it gets in April in Georgia, and I thought about my son in his hospital bed, and my mother at her kitchen table writing things down on the back of receipts, and I thought about how long the past takes to arrive. Patricia Webb Morrison was a small, careful woman in her early 50s with her father's eyes. She had the envelope in a fireproof lockbox under her bed. She set it on the kitchen table between us, and she looked at both of us for a moment. "My daddy said Thomas was a good man who saw something he wasn't supposed to see," she said. "He said the Hartwells had people everywhere, in the county office, in the sheriff's department. He said Thomas knew that if he went forward himself, they'd find a way to discredit him or worse. He made copies and sent them to Daddy and said keep them safe until someone comes with the right questions." She pushed the envelope across the table. "You're asking the right questions," she said. The documents inside were 31 years old and still legible. Photocopies of financial records, deed transfers, notarized letters with names and signatures that matched names in our mother's notes. A sworn affidavit from Thomas himself, 3 pages, dated 10 days before his death, describing what he had found and what he had seen, and naming George Hartwell explicitly. And a second affidavit, shorter, signed by a man named Roland Dupree, a former county clerk, describing instructions he had received from Hartwell's attorney regarding the processing of certain property transfers. Roland Dupree was still alive. He was 81 years old and living in a nursing home in Colombia. Evelyn found him in 2 hours. He had been waiting, he told us when we called, for someone to ask. "I've been carrying that since 1987, he said. "My hands ain't clean, I know that. But I was young, and I was scared, and they made it very clear what happened to people who didn't cooperate. I'll talk to whoever needs to hear it. I should have talked a long time ago." I called a lawyer. Not a Savannah lawyer, not anyone with any connection to the coastal South Carolina networks that the Hartwells moved through. A federal attorney in Atlanta, a woman named Sandra O'Coffer, who specialized in civil rights property violations and had spent 20 years working cases involving exactly the kind of land theft our mother's notes described. I found her through a law school professor I had known for 30 years, who told me she was the best person in the southeastern United States for what I needed. Sandra listened to everything without interrupting. Then she said, "Mrs. Calloway, I need you to understand something. What you have here has the potential to be a significant federal case. Property fraud, possible conspiracy, and now what sounds like an assault on your son that may be connected to the underlying pattern. This is not small. This is going to take time, and it may get harder before it gets better. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Daniel in that hospital bed. I thought about his laugh disappearing in pieces. I thought about Thomas Webb and his car accident, and my mother at her kitchen table with her receipts. "Tell me what you need from me," I said. What followed was 7 months of the kind of quiet, methodical work that legal processes require. Sandra coordinated with federal investigators. The affidavits were authenticated. Financial forensics were brought in to trace the property transactions across decades. Roland Dupree gave a formal recorded statement. Patricia Webb Morrison turned over the original documents for analysis. Daniel, meanwhile, had left the hospital and then, 3 weeks later, with a concussion that had left him with headaches and some difficulty concentrating, had called me on a Sunday afternoon for the first time in over a year. He didn't say much at first. I didn't push. We talked about the weather, and about a nature documentary he had watched, and about whether my azaleas were blooming yet. Then there was a long silence. "Mom," he said, "I'm here. I think I need to come home for a while." "The room is ready," I said. "It's always ready." He came home 3 days later with 2 suitcases and a bruise that had faded to yellow-green along his temple. He sat in Raymond's old armchair in the living room, and he looked out the window at the yard, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he started talking. He told me about the last 2 years, about Harland coming to him 6 months after the wedding with what he described as an opportunity, involvement in a property development deal, the kind that required Daniel to sign certain documents, to look past certain details, to understand that being part of the family meant being part of how the family operated, about the pressure that came when Daniel hesitated, the way Courtney changed, the isolation, slow and methodical, from his friends, from me, from anyone who might have offered a perspective Harland didn't want Daniel to have. He told me he had started asking questions about the deal, about the original properties, about a discrepancy he had noticed in some documents he wasn't supposed to have fully read. He told me he had written some things down and saved them to a drive, and that Harland had found out, and that 2 days before the parking garage incident, Harland had come to the house while Courtney was there and had told Daniel very calmly and very quietly what happened to people who caused problems for the family. "I was going to go to you," Daniel said. "I was trying to figure out how. I didn't want to pull you into it. I didn't want you to be in danger." "Baby," I said, "I have been in this since before you were born. I just didn't know it yet." He looked at me then. I told him about Mama's notes, about Thomas Webb, About Patricia and the envelope and Roland Dupree and Sandra Okafor. I watched his face as I talked, and I watched the thing that had been sitting behind his eyes for 2 years, that tight, coiled, isolated fear, slowly begin to loosen. When Sandra's team moved, they moved quietly and completely. Federal charges were filed on a Tuesday morning in March. Harland Hartwell was arrested at his home in Bluffton. His attorney and 2 associates were arrested separately. 3 county officials, 2 of them retired, were named in the indictment. The case involved 17 properties, 4 decades of fraud, and the coordinated suppression of evidence going back to the early 1980s. The assault on Daniel, because that is what it was, that is what the investigation confirmed, was charged separately. Courtney was not charged. I want to be clear about that. Not because I have any warmth left for her, but because the truth matters. And she was not part of the criminal enterprise in any knowing, prosecutable way. She was, in the end, another person who had been inside that family and had learned to look past things and call it loyalty. What she and Daniel do with their marriage is between them. That is not my story to tell. The families who lost their properties, some of them, or their descendants, were identified through the federal investigation. The process of making them whole is long and imperfect, and the law is an incomplete instrument for what was taken. I know that. Sandra knows that. But it has begun, and beginning matters. Daniel stayed with me for 4 months. He got better slowly, the way people get better from things that were both physical and not. The headaches faded, the weight came back, and one Sunday afternoon in June, I heard him laugh at something on television. That full sound, like his father's. And I had to go stand in the kitchen for a minute with my hand on the counter. He is doing well now. He has found a different kind of work, quieter, more his own. We talk on Sundays again. He asks about the azaleas. People sometimes ask me how I stayed steady through all of it. How I sat across from federal investigators and attorneys and gave testimony and provided documents and navigated 7 months of process without falling apart. And I think about how to answer that honestly. I think it is this. I was never doing it alone. I was doing it with Evelyn, and with the memory of Thomas Webb, and with Roland Dupree's 81-year-old voice on the phone saying I've been carrying this a long time, and with Patricia Webb Morrison sliding an envelope across her kitchen table. I was doing it with my mother, who spent 30 years being invisible in other people's houses and used that invisibility the way only a very wise and patient person can. Writing things down on the backs of receipts and putting them in a shoebox, and trusting that someday, someone who needed them would come. She never told me about any of it. I don't know if she was protecting me or protecting the information or simply waiting to see if it ever became necessary, but she kept it. Through moves and years and her own health declining, she kept it in that shoebox in the back of the closet. And when she passed, she left the closet to Evelyn and left Evelyn's memory to me. That is what I would want people to understand. The powerful count on you believing that their power is permanent. They count on evidence disappearing and witnesses dying and families staying silent and the sheer exhaustion of fighting people who have resources you don't have. They count on time working in their favor. But evidence doesn't always disappear. Witnesses sometimes give their testimony to their children and ask them to keep it safe. And mothers, some mothers, the stubborn and patient kind, write things down. I think about my mother sometimes. In that kitchen, at that table, with whatever receipt or scrap of paper was available to her. I think about what it cost her to know what she knew and stay quiet about it and keep going to work. I think about the particular kind of courage it takes to play a long game when you don't know if there will ever be an ending, when the entire weight of every institution around you says that nothing you have will ever be enough. She made it enough. She made it more than enough. Patience, I tell Daniel on Sundays, when he asks how I stay steady about things. And the truth. Your grandmother taught me that.